Monday, it was a disorganized mess of showers barely worth mentioning. By Tuesday morning, it had a name-worthy trajectory attached to it, and a 70% chance of becoming something real before the week is even over. That is how fast this story has moved, and if you have not been checking the tropics daily this week, you are already behind on one of the more significant systems this Atlantic season has produced so far. Let me catch you all up completely, because this system's story has genuinely changed with almost every single forecast update. Here is exactly where things stand right now. As of Tuesday's outlook from the National Hurricane Center, the system in question is sitting roughly 500 miles southwest of the Cabo Verde Islands, out in the central tropical Atlantic. Thunderstorm activity tied to the disturbance remained limited as of Tuesday morning, but forecasters were direct in saying that environmental conditions are expected to become considerably more favorable for organization over the next couple of days. The numbers reflect that shift clearly. A 30% chance of development within the next 48 hours, and a 70% chance of formation across the full 7-day window. 70% is not a coin flip. That is a system forecasters genuinely expect to organize, and I want y'all treating it with exactly that level of seriousness starting today. The Hurricane Center's own forecast discussion lays it out clearly, noting that showers and thunderstorms associated with this tropical wave over the central Atlantic are showing signs of improved organization, and that a tropical depression will likely form during the latter half of this week as the system continues moving westward to west-northwestward, approaching the Lesser Antilles over the weekend. Think about that timeline for a second. A system that looked unremarkable at the start of this week is now expected to be a formally designated tropical depression, approaching populated islands before the same week even wraps up. I want to slow down here and give you all the honest uncertainty still baked into this forecast, because a responsible breakdown has to include this even when the headline number keeps climbing. The exact track this system ultimately takes remains genuinely split between two very different outcomes. Most model guidance currently favors a weaker system tracking, generally westward, moving near or through the easternmost Caribbean islands late this weekend into early next week. But a smaller cluster of outlier model runs show a stronger version of the same system curving north of the islands entirely, out into the open central Atlantic, in a pattern some forecasters have compared to a repetitive curving track seen multiple times last year, where a system threatens the islands directly only to bend northward at the last moment. This track split genuinely matters for who needs to be watching most closely and what kind of impact to prepare for. Under the majority-favored weaker, more southern scenario, the system tracks through or near the Lesser Antilles, and potentially near the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, arriving somewhere between this weekend and early next week. Under the smaller set of outlier scenarios, a stronger system catching the northward pull of a dip in the jet stream could track near or north of the Leeward Islands, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands beginning as early as Thursday, potentially sparing the islands a direct hit precisely because it strengthened enough to feel that northward tug. I also want to give you all a real comparison from recent hurricane history, because a strikingly similar setup played out in this exact same stretch of ocean 5 years back, and it helps illustrate both what could plausibly happen next and why forecasters are taking the system so seriously right now. Back in August 2021, a strong tropical wave came off the African coast, and within a single day, the Hurricane Center had already bumped its 5-day formation odds up to high as it tracked westward across the Atlantic. By the time it neared the Lesser Antilles, it had been designated potential tropical cyclone 6, carrying a 90% formation probability. That system went on to cross the leewards, push into the northeastern Caribbean, and become Tropical Storm Fred just south of Puerto Rico, eventually striking the Greater Antilles and the southeastern U.S., leaving 7 people dead and causing more than $1 billion in damage. I'm not saying today's system is destined to repeat that outcome. The intense Caribbean shear currently in place could easily prevent that. But the underlying shape of the story, a main development region system organizing fast and approaching the islands right as its odds cross the 70% mark, is exactly the pattern that has, in living memory, turned into a genuinely damaging storm, which is why I am giving this week's update this much airtime. Let me also explain why forecasters are showing y'all a split between a majority track and outlier scenarios instead of a single confident answer, because understanding that process matters here. When the conventional physics-based European ensemble and the newer AI-driven European ensemble get run against the same starting data, they typically spit out a spread of plausible outcomes rather than one clean answer. Because 5 to 7 days out, the atmosphere still holds real uncertainty no single model run can eliminate. Forecasters look at how many individual ensemble members cluster around a given path, weigh that against the physical setup driving each scenario, and communicate the result as a probability-weighted range rather than a single false confidence prediction. That is exactly why this week's coverage keeps referencing a majority-favored weaker, southern track alongside a smaller cluster of outlier runs pushing the system north, not indecision, but honest uncertainty communication. As the system draws nearer to the islands over the coming days, that spread should tighten up considerably, giving both forecasters and y'all a much sharper read on which outcome is actually going to happen. I also want to place this system inside the bigger picture of how this season has unfolded so far, because the contrast is genuinely worth noting. This year has run well below its historical average pace overall, with just 2 named storms, Arthur and Bertha, forming to date, both out of the Gulf rather than the open Atlantic. A system tracing back to a classic Cabo Verde region wave like this one is a genuinely different animal than anything tracked so far this year, and it is showing up right as the basin crosses into its climatological peak window, August 15th through October 15th, the stretch responsible for the overwhelming majority of any given season's most significant storms. NOAA still projects a below normal season overall, driven by this year's strengthening El Niño and the very same elevated shear currently working against this system, holding together once it hits the Caribbean. But a suppressed season-long outlook has never meant 0 storms capable of organizing. And this week's system is shaping up to be the clearest test yet of whether the basin's improving peak season environment can outrun that El Niño-driven shear. Here's the detail that genuinely raises the stakes for anybody in the system's potential path, and it is exactly why I built this video around the question of whether y'all are ready. Forecasters have specifically flagged that tropical storm watches or warnings could be required with shorter than normal lead times for the Leeward Islands, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. I want y'all to sit with what that actually means. It means the usual buffer of advance notice you would expect before an official watch or warning goes up may be compressed for this specific system, which is exactly the scenario where waiting until an official alert arrives to start preparing puts you meaningfully behind where you need to be. Let me also walk y'all through the second system still on this week's board, because its story is heading in the opposite direction entirely. A trough of low pressure sitting several hundred miles northeast of Bermuda is producing showers and thunderstorms, with some development possible through Wednesday as it moves east at roughly 20 miles per hour. But forecasters expect it to move into cooler waters later this week, ending its shot at development by Thursday. Its formation odds sit at just 10% through both the 48-hour and 7-day windows, a considerably less concerning trajectory than the system racing toward the islands. I also want to explain exactly why this primary system's fate may ultimately come down to what it runs into once it actually reaches Caribbean waters. Forecasters have specifically described what they call a blistering fire hose of wind shear currently sitting over the Caribbean, historically elevated levels of disruptive upper-level wind that make it genuinely difficult for any organized tropical system to hold together once it crosses into that stretch of water. That shear is exactly why most model guidance currently favors this system staying weak even as it approaches and potentially moves through the islands, since entering that kind of hostile environment tends to prevent a system from building on whatever organization it managed to achieve out over open water. I also want to connect this system's rainfall potential to a story I have covered extensively on this channel already, because there is a real, meaningful silver lining tangled up in this otherwise serious forecast. Puerto Rico is currently living through a severe water crisis, with more than 180,000 residents across San Juan and 6 neighboring municipalities under strict water rationing, following the driest July San Juan has recorded in over 120 years. Regardless of whether this system ever earns a name, forecasters expect it to bring meaningful rainfall to the eastern Caribbean, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands as it approaches, rainfall that could genuinely help ease a crisis currently forcing tens of thousands of households onto a 48-hour water rotation. I do not want that silver lining to overshadow the real hazard a system like this one carries, since intense rainfall delivered all at once through a tropical system frequently produces flash flooding even while helping a longer-term drought. Both things can be true here at the exact same time. I also want to explain what changes procedurally once this system officially crosses into depression status, since it affects how y'all should be consuming updates from here forward. Once that formal designation happens, the Hurricane Center shifts from broad, twice-daily outlook updates to structured advisories issued every 6 hours, each one carrying a specific forecast track, expected intensity, and any watches or warnings required for land areas in the path. Depending on how confident forecasters are in the system's structure at that point, reconnaissance aircraft may also get sent directly into it, gathering central pressure and flight-level wind data that satellite imagery alone simply cannot provide. That shift, from occasional outlook check-ins to detailed 6-hourly advisories, is exactly the kind of transition that should have y'all moving from casual daily glances to genuinely frequent monitoring, especially if you live anywhere across the islands, sitting closest to this system's majority-favored track. So let me bring this together and tell y'all exactly what I want different groups of y'all doing as this week continues. If you live anywhere across the Leeward Islands, the Virgin Islands, or Puerto Rico, treat this system as an active, near-term concern starting today, not once this weekend actually arrives. Given the explicit warning about compressed lead times, do not wait for an official watch or warning before you begin preparing. Check your hurricane kit today. Confirm your family's communication plan today. Know your evacuation route if you live somewhere flood-prone or low-lying today, well before any official alert requires it of you. If you live further west, across Hispaniola, Jamaica, or the broader Caribbean, keep close tabs on the system's evolution over the coming days, since the westward, weaker track scenario favored by most models would eventually push whatever survives of this system, or its remnant moisture, into your part of the basin as well. I will be checking on the system multiple times a day for the rest of this week, given exactly how quickly its numbers have already climbed, and I will have updates out the moment either that expected depression forms, or the track picture sharpens enough to tell us definitively whether the islands are facing a direct approach or that northward escape route some of the outlier models continue to show. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly why this week's forecast has gotten more serious with almost every single update, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I do not want anybody missing the moment this system's track finally locks in. Share this video right now with anybody you know across the Leeward Islands, the Virgin Islands, or Puerto Rico, because a forecast that keeps worsening day after day is exactly the kind of story where even one extra day of advance notice can change the outcome. I will keep watching the tropics for y'all, and I will see y'all in the next one. Stay weather aware, and I love y'all.